2 years had passed. The Duke of Blackmoor returned to the house he had once left behind, the place he had fled from. Only now did he dare come back to look upon it again. It had been a long time since he last set foot on this road. The carriage could not manage the last half-mile, so he walked his boots, crushing the thin crust of the evening frost, his breath rising in pale white wisps before him. The house still stood at the end of the lane, as if patiently awaiting someone. Quiet, patient, and still. It was a place that, in his dreams, still held its warmth. Yet he knew that what awaited him now would be nothing but silence and the dust of passing years. Yet how strange. A thread of wood smoke was rising from the chimney, curling into the sky just as it once had. Nathaniel Ashford stopped short, stunned. Then he strode toward the house, faster now, anger rising in him. What vagrant would dare set foot in this place? He shoved the door open hard with the flat of his hand. The candles were lit. A pot hung steaming over the hearth. There were 2 pairs of small, muddy boots by the door, a child's boots, and the warm, impossible smell of bread. Then a woman stepped out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, calling out to ask who was there. She looked up. The ladle slipped from her fingers and rang against the stone floor. Time seemed to stand still. There was no sound, no breath, only this single moment, because Nathaniel Ashford was looking at the face of his wife. The wife he had wept over, the wife whose coffin he had carried upon his own shoulders. The wife beside whose grave he had stood in the rain for 2 long years. Eleanor, he whispered. It was barely a sound. And then, from the top of the narrow staircase, a small voice broke the silence. "Mama? Mama, who is that man?" A little boy stood on the landing in a nightshirt, clutching the rail, staring down at the stranger in the doorway with his father's own dark eyes. His own son did not know his face. And in that moment, the Duke of Blackmoor understood something that turned his very heart to ice. He had not merely been lied to. Someone had deceived him. Someone who had reached into his life and stolen 2 whole years from him. A wife, a child, an entire world, and buried it where he would never think to look. If you think you already know who did this, and why, I promise you, you do not. Because the truth of what happened in this house is darker and closer to home than the Duke could ever have imagined. Welcome to Crown and Ashes. Subscribe now, and stay to the very end, because the reckoning that follows will be one you never forget. To understand how a living woman came to lie in a sealed grave, and how the man who loved her came to carry her coffin, we must go back. Back to the winter it all began. 2 years earlier, Nathaniel Ashford was the most envied man in 3 counties, and the loneliest. He had inherited the Dukedom of Blackmoor at 26, along with a great cold house, a great cold fortune, and a stepmother who had married his late father for exactly those 2 things. Her name was Lady Margaret Ashford. She had given his father no children of her own, and so when the old Duke died, the entire estate passed to Nathaniel, every acre, every coin, every candlestick, and Margaret was left with only what a widow's settlement allowed her. She smiled at the reading of the will. She smiled the way winter smiles, and she began quietly to wait. Nathaniel barely noticed her. He was a serious young man, more comfortable with account books than with people, and he had resigned himself to a life without warmth. Dukes did not marry for love. They married for alliance, for land, for bloodlines. Margaret had already selected 3 suitable heiresses and arranged for their families to visit. And then, at a village fair he attended only out of duty, Nathaniel met Eleanor. She was not an heiress. She was the daughter of a country physician, clever, plain-spoken, with ink stains on her fingers and no patience for flattery. When the Duke of Blackmoor was introduced to her, she did not curtsy low and flutter. She looked him in the eye and asked him whether he truly enjoyed being bowed to, or whether it simply saved him the trouble of conversation. He laughed. For the first time in years, he laughed. They were married within the season, and the county was scandalized, and Nathaniel did not care. For the first time, the great cold house on the hill had fires in every room. Eleanor filled it with music she played badly, and books she read aloud, and arguments they both enjoyed losing. She learned the names of every servant, and the troubles of every tenant. Where the old Duke had been feared, she was loved. There was only one person in Blackmoor who did not love her. Lady Margaret watched the new Duchess win the household, win the county, win her stepson's whole heart, and she understood what it meant. If Eleanor gave Nathaniel a child, an heir, then Margaret's last thin hope of ever inheriting anything would be gone forever, a widow with no claim, a guest in a house that would never be hers. So when Eleanor came to Nathaniel one spring morning, radiant, and whispered that she was carrying his child, 2 people in that house felt their lives change. One of them wept with joy. The other began to plan. Lady Margaret was patient, and she was clever, and she never once raised her voice. She began with small things. A word to a visiting lady about how tired the Duchess looked. A gentle, worried question to the housekeeper about whether the Duchess had been quite herself lately. She planted the idea, seed by seed, that Eleanor's health was fragile, that the pregnancy was dangerous, that the poor young Duchess might not be strong enough to survive it. None of it was true. Eleanor had never been healthier in her life, but Margaret was building something, and every good lie needs a foundation of smaller ones. The second thing she did was find a man who could be bought. Dr. Price was the physician Margaret, summoned to attend the Duchess through her confinement, not old Dr. Fletcher, whom Eleanor trusted, but a stranger from the city, a man with elegant manners, expensive debts, and a flexible conscience. Margaret paid those debts. In return, Dr. Price agreed to a single, monstrous arrangement, the details of which she explained to him by candlelight in words so calm they frightened even him. The third thing she did was wait for Nathaniel to leave. The opportunity came in the autumn. A dispute over the northern estates required the Duke to travel to London, a journey of many weeks. Eleanor, heavily pregnant now, begged him not to go. She could not have said why. She only knew that Margaret had been kind to her lately, and Margaret's kindness felt like the stillness before a storm. But the estate could not run itself, and Nathaniel promised to return before the child came, and he kissed her forehead. And he rode away. He did not know it was the last time he would see her smile for 2 years. What happened next, Nathaniel would only piece together much later, and every piece would cut him. 3 nights after the Duke left, Eleanor's pains began early, too early. The household panicked. Dr. Price took charge, and he ordered everyone but Margaret out of the room, and he locked the door. Eleanor's son was born just before dawn. A healthy boy, strong-lunged, dark-eyed. For one moment, holding him, exhausted and overjoyed, Eleanor believed the worst was behind her. Then Dr. Price pressed a cloth soaked in something sweet over her face, and the world went dark. She did not die. That was never the plan. A dead Duchess would be examined, mourned, investigated. What Margaret wanted was cleaner than murder and far more permanent. When Eleanor woke, she was in the back of a covered cart many miles from Blackmoor, with no child in her arms and a stranger driving. Margaret had arranged it all. The Duchess was to be carried far to the north, given a small sum, and told the truth in the plainest possible terms, that a document had been signed declaring her dead of childbirth, that a weighted coffin was already being prepared, that if she ever returned to Blackmoor, ever tried to contact the Duke, ever breathed a word, the child would be the one to suffer for it. Because Margaret had kept the child. That was the cruelty at the heart of it. Margaret held the baby as her hostage. As long as Eleanor stayed dead and stayed silent, the boy would be raised safely, quietly, in the country. If Eleanor ever surfaced, Margaret swore the child would simply vanish. And who would question a grieving family that had already buried a mother? Eleanor was a physician's daughter. She was clever enough to know the threat was real, and clever enough to know that a frightened woman who runs to the law with no proof is a woman easily called mad. She had no body, no witnesses, no husband within reach, and a powerful enemy who had already forged her own death certificate. So Eleanor did the only thing a mother could do. She pretended to obey. She let them believe she was broken. She took the small sum, and she disappeared into the north. And then, the moment she was free of them, she turned around and began, slowly, patiently, to find her way back to her son. Nathaniel came home to a house draped in black. They told him his wife had died in the night, that the birth had been too much for her fragile constitution, that the child, a boy, they were so sorry, had been too weak and had not survived the week. 2 graves. A wife and a son, gone in a single autumn, while he argued over property in London. He did not believe it at first. He demanded to see Dr. Price, who wept convincingly and produced signed papers. He demanded to see the housekeeper, who could only sob. He demanded to see Margaret, and Margaret. Oh, Margaret was magnificent. She held his hands. She told him she had been at Eleanor's side to the very end. She told him Eleanor's last words had been his name, and Nathaniel, drowning in grief, believed her. Why would he not? Grief does not look for conspiracies. Grief only looks for something to hold on to. He carried the coffin himself. He would not let the servants do it. He carried the weight of it on his own shoulder from the house to the little churchyard. And he stood in the rain while they lowered it, and he thought the weight felt strange. Lighter than a person, heavier than nothing, but grief plays such tricks, and he did not let himself wonder. He buried a box of sand and stone beneath a headstone with his wife's name on it. And then he shut up the small house where they had spent their happiest summer, the country house, not the great hall, the little house where Eleanor had wanted to raise their children away from the cold formality of Blackmoor, because he could not bear to look at it. He locked its doors. He let it stand empty, and he went back to being the cold, serious, lonely man he had been before a woman with ink-stained fingers asked him whether he enjoyed being bowed to. 2 years passed. As fortune would have it, Margaret greedy, though she was still kept the child alive. Perhaps some last scrap of conscience remained in her, or perhaps the boy was simply her final insurance. He was kept by a paid nurse in a distant cottage, healthy and hidden. The Duke was nothing but a ghost in his own house. And the estate. The estate would come to Margaret in the end of that. She was certain, for a man so broken would never marry again, never father an heir. A man like that would die soon enough. The property would revert, and she would finally have what she had married for. She had accounted for everything. She had not accounted for Eleanor. It had taken Eleanor 2 years to come home, because she had come home the careful way. She had not run to Blackmoor screaming. She had crept back into the county under another name, taken work as a seamstress, and listened. She had learned where they kept her son. She had learned the nurse was underpaid and unhappy and no friend to Lady Margaret, and one night, with the last of her savings and the help of that unhappy nurse, Eleanor had simply walked into the cottage and taken her child back into her arms, and the boy, who had been told his mother was in heaven, had looked at her, and after a long moment had reached for her anyway. She needed somewhere to hide him, somewhere no one would think to look, somewhere locked and empty and forgotten. She remembered the little country house, the happy house, the one Nathaniel had loved too much to enter and too much to sell. She still had her old key, worn smooth from a summer of coming and going. And so the Duchess of Blackmoor had brought her stolen son home to the one place in the world her husband would never go. And she had lit the fires and baked the bread and begun, at last, to plan how to prove to the world that she was alive. She had thought she had a little more time. She had not counted on Nathaniel finally deciding, after 2 years, that it was time to let the happy house go. Which is how a duke came to open a door, he thought, led to an empty room, and found his whole life standing in the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. For a long moment in that candlelit kitchen, no one spoke.
Don't leave us.
Then Eleanor
Not
said
now.
the only thing she could say.
He's
yours, she whispered, and her voice broke on the word.
Don't leave us.
Nathaniel,
Not now.
he's your son. His name is Thomas. Nathaniel crossed the room. He did not embrace her. He could not yet. Not with his mind reeling, but he took her face in his hands, as though he needed to prove she was warm, that she was real, that she was not one more cruel trick of a grief that had never let him go. She was warm, she was real, she was weeping. They told me you were dead, he said. I carried your coffin. I stood at your grave. I know, she said. I know you did. Then who, he said, and his voice was terrible and quiet, is buried in it. And Eleanor, holding her husband's hands in the house they had loved, told him everything. The locked room, Dr. Price, and his sweet-smelling cloth, the cart to the north, the threat against their child. 2 years of silence, bought with a mother's terror. She told it plainly, the way a physician's daughter tells a hard truth, and with every word she spoke, Nathaniel's face changed from disbelief to horror, to a cold and gathering fury that she had never seen in him before and would never forget. Because there was only one person who had been in that locked room, only one person who had held his hands at the graveside and told him Eleanor's dying words, only one person for whom a dead duchess and a vanished heir meant an entire fortune. Margaret, he said. Little Thomas, frightened by the strange man's voice, began to cry, and Eleanor gathered him up, and the boy hid his face in his mother's shoulder. Nathaniel looked at his son, really looked at the dark Ashford eyes, at the small hands, and something in him that had been frozen for 2 years cracked straight down the middle. He had a wife. He had a son, and a woman under his own roof had stolen them both and sold him 2 years of mourning to do it. Stay here, he told Eleanor. Both of you, lock the door and open it for no one but me. I will come back for you. I swear it on my father's name. But first, he stopped at the threshold, and when he turned back, his face was carved from stone. First, I am going to give my stepmother the reckoning she has spent 2 years earning. Here is what Lady Margaret Ashford expected on the morning the Duke returned to Blackmoor Hall. She expected the same broken ghost who had haunted the halls for 2 years. She had heard he had gone to the country house to arrange its sale, and she thought it a healthy sign, a man finally letting go of the dead. What walked into her drawing room was not a ghost. It was a duke. Nathaniel did not shout. That was the first thing that frightened her. He simply sat down across from her, and he asked her in a pleasant voice to tell him again about the night his wife died. And Margaret practiced, confident, certain of her ground, told the story she had told 100 times. The fragile constitution, the tragic birth, the weak child, Eleanor's last words. His name, Nathaniel said, when she had finished, is Thomas. Margaret's face did not move, but her hand, resting on the arm of her chair, went very still. He is nearly 2 years old, Nathaniel went on, in that same pleasant voice. He has my eyes. He is, at this moment, eating bread that his mother baked in the house where I proposed to her. His mother, madam, my wife, the Duchess of Blackmoor, who is not, it turns out, in her grave, because you never put her there. For the length of one breath, Margaret considered denial. He saw her consider it, and then he laid it all on the table between them, piece by piece. The way she herself had once built her lies, Dr. Price's debts, which Nathaniel had spent the ride home resolving to trace, and had already set his solicitors upon the paid nurse in the distant cottage who could be found, the weighted coffin, which could be exhumed. Every thread she had pulled to unmake his life was a thread that could now be followed straight back to her hand. "You have no proof," she said at last, very softly. "I have a living wife," he answered. "I have a living son. I have a physician who will discover when my solicitors are finished with him that his freedom is worth more than your money. And I have a grave, madam, that I will open tomorrow before witnesses, magistrates, the bishop, every gossiping lord in this county, so that all of them may see exactly what the Duke of Blackmoor carried on his shoulder in the rain." Now, at last, Margaret understood, and the winter smile she had worn for 2 years finally cracked. "Everything I did," she hissed, and the mask came away. "I did, because your father left me nothing. I gave that man the best years of my life, and he left me a widow's pittance and a stepson who looked through me like I was glass. This house should have been mine. That fortune should have been mine. You were owed a comfortable life, which you had," Nathaniel said, rising to his feet. "Instead, you chose to steal a mother from her child, and 2 years from a man who never wished you ill. You were not owed my family, Margaret. No one is owed another person's life." They opened the grave the next morning, before witnesses, and inside the coffin they found sand and stones, and no wife of anyone at all. Dr. Price, faced with the magistrates and the ruin of his own name, told everything in exchange for mercy he only half received. And Lady Margaret Ashford, who had wanted a great house and a great fortune, was given instead a small cell, and a great deal of time in which to consider the difference. Nathaniel could have done worse to her. The law and his rank, and the fury still burning in him, would all have allowed it. There were men who urged him to press for the harshest possible sentence, to ruin every distant relation who had ever taken Margaret's side, to make the vengeance total. He thought about it. He thought about the 2 years. He thought about the weight of a coffin on his shoulder in the rain. And then he went home to the little country house, and he did none of it, because when he opened that door, the same door that had shattered his world a week before, his son came running across the floor on unsteady legs, and this time did not ask who he was. And Eleanor looked up from the fire with ink stains on her fingers and asked him, in a voice he had missed for 2 years, whether he truly enjoyed being a duke, or whether it simply saved him the trouble of being happy. He laughed. God help him, after everything, he laughed. They did not go back to the great cold hall on the hill. They gave Blackmoor Hall over to the tenants and the tacksmen and the memory of the woman who had poisoned it, and they kept the little house, the happy house, and they filled it, room by room, with the life that had been stolen and given back. Margaret had been right about one thing. There are people who lose a fortune and discover too late what poverty really is. And there are people who lose everything else, the person they love, the years they will never get back, the trust they can never fully rebuild, and learn, slowly, that no house and no title and no revenge on earth is worth as much as the sound of a child calling your name and, at last, knowing your face. Nathaniel Ashford had buried his wife, and mourned her, and carried her weight in the rain. And in the end, the greatest reckoning was not the cell he sent his enemy to, nor the grave he opened before the county, nor the fortune he kept from the woman who tried to take it. The greatest reckoning was this, that he chose not to spend the rest of his life buried in the past that had been done to him, and walked, instead, back into the warm and candle-lit house where his family was waiting, and shut the cold world out behind him for good.